Wonderful. John chapter 15, the first few verses there. And this week is week 2 of our Vision and Giving Sundays. And we're using this passage last week and this, where Jesus uses the imagery, like the picture of a big grapevine, to describe something of who he is and how we're connected to him. Like a branch, he says, we're all like branches connected into him, the vine. And if we do that, then like a vine and like branches bear good fruit, we too will bear good fruit. And the Bible talks about the fruit of the Spirit as being like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And our vision here at St. Swithin's, like the reason we say we're here, we use 3 words to describe that. We say that we are here so that people encounter the love of God, that people learn to live more like Jesus, and so that together we might go and see lives and communities transformed. And I think it's fair to say that usually when we talk about vision, we often talk about that third one, that idea about how do we go from here and share the news of Jesus. But this time round, as we come to the end of a church year, it's Happy New Year, we say next Sunday, it's the start of Advent. As we come to a new end of a year and anticipate the coming of Jesus, we just want to focus a little bit more on those first 2 words, about how, and we looked at this last week, we can encounter the love of God more, how we can be more connected to the vine. And this week, I want to think about how we might live more like Jesus. If Jesus is the vine and we are the branches, how do we make sure we're healthy branches? And the passage talks about chopping and shaping and cleaning and pruning and training the branches in such a way that they bear really good fruit. I remember after Vicky and I moved into a new house, this is going back quite a few years, and we took up a new job as youth and children's workers for a church down in Kent. And there was a garden there that had been established for some time, and across the side of the garden was this massive shrub hedge, like this really big, thick hedge. And it was kind of okay because it kept things private for us, and it went along the side of a road, so it kind of kept us safe as well, but it was a little bit overgrown. And Vicky's dad came down one weekend, and he asked, "Can I do any jobs for you? You've just moved into the house. What jobs can I do for you?" And as it happened, we'd just had a letter through the letterbox that weekend from the council saying, "Somebody has complained about your hedge overgrowing onto the footpath. Please, would you chop it back?" So we found some hedge trimmers, gave them to Vicky's dad, and set him off. A simple job, we thought. Just go and trim the hedge a little bit, stop the branches overgrowing. Now, it got to lunchtime, and we suddenly realized as we were sitting down to lunch that Vicky's dad wasn't there. It was like a couple of hours later, and we were thinking, where's Vicky's dad gone? Maybe he's gone to the shops, or... So I went outside to look for him, and he was still there, chopping away this hedge. Now, he's a Yorkshire man, so he's making sure, I think he got his money's worth out of the hedge trimmers, because the hedge that was massive and overgrowing and this tall was kind of that small, and like basically most of the hedge was on the floor in pieces, and the hedge looked really dead. All the safety, all the privacy, all the beauty of this hedge suddenly was on the floor. And what was left just looked ugly. We actually thought he might have killed it off totally. But he assured us, being an experienced gardener, that it had been left to grow for too long. And actually inside the hedge, there were bits of the hedge that were dying, there were bits of the hedge that were diseased, and there were bits that were just stopping the light come through into the rest of the garden for everything else to grow. And sure enough, by the spring, new shoots had begun to emerge. And the whole thing over the next couple of years grew much greener, much healthier. It allowed more light into the garden, and it meant things near it grew even better. It even began to flower, which we didn't even know it could do. And what Jesus says in John 15 is that God cuts off He prunes the branches. Those branches that don't bear fruit, he cuts back. Those that are dead, he cuts off. Those that might have appeared to be a little bit fruitful, he still chops as well. Maybe you've experienced something of this. Maybe you're experiencing this now, like a cutting back, something that seemed to be going okay, or maybe something in your prayer life or your spiritual life, or maybe just something in the rest of your life. You thought it was going okay, but all of a sudden it feels like stuff is being stripped back. Perhaps that's feeling quite harsh and actually quite painful at the moment as you see the things that you thought were growing well disappear. Perhaps you're wondering, what have I done to upset God? Why is God not listening to my prayers? Have I done something to upset him? But maybe it isn't in fact that God isn't distant or doesn't care or isn't hearing your prayers. Maybe instead, God the gardener is lovingly and tenderly pruning you and shaping you, ready to bear much fruit. Maybe when it feels like you're down to nothing, just maybe God is up to something. Maybe when you feel like you're being stripped back to nothing, could it be that God is about to be up to something? And maybe even though it's hard to see or to recognize that the gardener knows what he's doing, but actually, if we look here, you probably can't see, but where a previous branch has been cut back, there's just a new, I don't know if you can see that, just one really small leaf. And if I begin to look at all the other places where previously branches have been cut off, there's signs of life, there's new buds getting ready to burst through. You see, the gardener has now created space and conditions for new things to grow and to flourish, to bear much fruit. When it feels like you're down to nothing, maybe it's God up to something. And maybe for each one of us, there are also some things in our lives that either need to be cut off because they're not about living like Jesus. Maybe there's some things that are dead, but if we allow God to prune and cut them back a little bit, we may find that he brings new growth. For example, this vine's not looking very healthy, but think about time. Think about time we have and how we spend that. Other ways that we use our time that's not very fruitful, and maybe God just wants to prune that back. Or maybe, what about the way we speak? Might we need to be pruned a bit, where we don't always use our words well, where we don't speak well of others, or maybe we gossip, or maybe we have a critical voice, or we even use God's name as a swear word? Or what about what we look at? Might that need pruning a little bit as well? What do we look at on our phones and in other places that shape our thinking, that shape our identity, that shape even our mental health? Maybe there's some things there that God wants to prune. Or what about how we view and use our money and our possessions? Might they need to be pruned back a bit in terms of whose we see them as and how we use them? Or what about where the focus of our life is? Might we need to just have that pruned back a bit in terms of what we're focused on and what our aims are in life? And as the gardener prunes those things, he wants to grow new things in its place. He wants to grow healthy branches about how we use our time. How we use our time, not just to spend time with him, but to live like Jesus. And maybe he wants to grow some new healthy branches about how we speak in such a way that we live like Jesus, encouraging one another, sharing Jesus with others, and using our voice to speak up for those who don't have one. And maybe he wants to grow a new branch in us that's healthy in terms of what shapes our thinking, our identity, our mental health. That coming not from doom scrolling, but from Scripture and from prayer and from fellowship with one another. And maybe he wants to grow a new branch in us that's healthy around our money and our possessions, seeing everything as we have a gift from him, a blessing from him that we might use to bless others. And maybe he wants to grow a healthy branch in us that bears much fruit around what our life is focused on, what our aims and ambitions are, rather than being about our own things, being focused on God and his kingdom. Maybe sometimes God strips us back to nothing. And maybe sometimes we need to be open and willing for him to do that in order that God would be up to something. And as a church, how do we do this together? Well, there's many branches in the vine, healthy and fruitful. And when all the branches are healthy and fruitful, it produces a bigger crop. Where maybe some are maybe a little bit dead or dying, it can affect the whole vine. And so as a church, how can we support one another and remind one another to abide in the vine, not focusing on the fruit, but trusting the gardener? How can we walk with one another as we experience pruning? And how as a church maybe do we prune things in our busy life to allow space for life and growth and fruit? And all that sounds like a lot of effort. Jeff, as he was cutting the hedge, like he must have had biceps the size of, tennis balls by the time he'd finished. It's a lot of work to prune. And if we hear this wrong, we can think, gosh, I've got to go away from here and do this. That's to miss the point. The point is that God is the gardener. Jesus is the vine. They're the ones who shape us and train us to produce fruit. Our job is to remain in the vine, to look to Jesus, and to trust the gardener, to trust the process. But could it be when we're down to nothing, when we allow God to prune us a little bit, that it's then we'll notice and see that God is up to something?